and I was going to say an ordinary economist, but an economist, a regular economist, would necessarily have any interest in the history of economic thought. There aren't so many of us. Some of us are in the room, of course. But Professor Buchanan has always taken a great interest in ideas of any sort, whether they're old or new. And so that's been our work to our great fortune, because he's then been able to talk to us with both the eye of an economist who's looking at what's happening around us, and also someone who's got a deep knowledge of old ideas as well. So please welcome James Buchanan to the 12th.
Well, thank you, Sandy. First of all, let me say that I'm not at fault for being late. Blame the coordinators of the conference. Well, I'm very glad to be here again, and this is always an interesting time for me to come and give something in opening of this. Actually, my comments today, or this talk today, is a sort of a part of a continuing sequence of reactions and comments on a lot of what has happened since the recession in 07, 08. And so in a sense it builds on the other things that I've given in the other years, prior years. Early on, I guess maybe 2 years ago, I talked about the fact that emphasizing that the problem was really one of constitutional failure, failure of the rules, rather than putting the onus of blame on the ethics of the participants or on policy changes as such, but rather the rules were wrong. Then last year, I was stimulated to write something more or less in response to a piece that had come out in the Chicago magazine, University of Chicago magazine, with a big feature article called "Was Chicago Economics to Blame?" And this guy was examining the whole concentration of interest on how the Chicago economists centered at Chicago the view that markets always work, and how that was to blame for the fact that economists didn't have more to say about the possibility of the Great Recession. And I didn't like the article. Not that I was trying to defend Chicago economics, but I didn't like the article because he failed to distinguish between what I call the old and new Chicago thinking, and that was the title of what I talked about here last year, namely the old and new Chicago thinking, because in that article he had said, he not even mentioned the old Chicago school, and my point was that there's quite a distinction that the old Chicago school, which I felt like I was a part of, or at least adhered to, would never have extended the idea of market efficiency to apply to everything. And the old Chicago school, I meant, of course, the school of prior to or immediately after World War II, namely Frank Knight being the dominant figure, with Henry Simons perhaps the most well-known expositor of policy positions, and Lloyd Mintz and others, as opposed to the sort of post-World War II group, which sort of starting with Friedman, but mainly exemplified best by the rational expectations extension of efficient market hypothesis. I'll get into that a little bit later. But he was placing full emphasis on the new Chicago school, and so that was what I was doing last year. I was contrasting the old and the new, and criticizing that article for its failure to recognize even the existence of the old Chicago school. And the old Chicago school would never have extended this notion of market efficiency to apply to the whole structure of the market economy. As I say, I'll come back to that a little bit later. But then, after I was here last year in the fall, I got occasion to look at a new book that was out, and by a man that I'd never heard of. Some of you, I'm sure, know about him. It's a book by Anatol Koletsky, and it's called Capitalism 4.0. And he places precise blame for the Great Recession on the Chicago-type economists, which he accuses of having been dominated by this notion of what he calls market fundamentalism, which he gets from George Soros. And actually this man works for George Soros Institute now, although for years he was a writer for the Financial Times and the Economist to some extent. And he makes the argument much more precise, much more succinct in a one-page article in this Economist, The World in 2011, the Economist version put out earlier this spring. And he has a one-page, Koletsky has a one-page article in there in which he makes it much more succinct, this argument that everything is due to the market fundamentalism of this Chicago-type economist, modern Chicago-type economist, and how that swept the economics profession. And my reaction to that is, I agree with him maybe that the economists were important, at least we all like to think they are, in dominating a lot of the actual events that happened, but that it wasn't ideology that mattered, it was scientific error. And so in that sense, I take issue with him. Actually, in terms of this book, he's pretty good in his criticism, pretty good in a factual record of what happened in the Great Recession, but rather hopeless as you get to trying to propose any change or remedies. It's kind of a combination of post-Keynesian, Krugmanite, with a little corporate notion, corporatism thrown in, the idea being that the new capitalism is going to be these big firms joining with politicians and therefore running the world, and he kind of fades away. But so the last third's not worth reading, but the first 2/3 are worth paying some attention to. So that's essentially the argument now that I'm making here, is that it's scientific error rather than ideological change, the ideological position that matters here. And it seems to me this is important. You might argue that, well, how do you make a distinction between scientific error and ideological stance? It seems to me that if you sort of go down the road acknowledging that it might be scientific error, at least you're on grounds for having a discussion. You can, and maybe coming up with some consensus on what might have happened and how we might reform things. Whereas if you start from a position where it's basically an ideological split that you're talking about, it's much more difficult to get a dialogue going, much more difficult to make any progress. So I finally I was thinking more about that, and then I came to emphasize more and more, for me at least in thinking about this, to emphasize more and more the idea that Samuelson had of this, what I call the Samuelson taxonomy. You remember in that classic piece, a little short piece in Review of Economic Studies in 1954, Samuelson, which he called a pure theory of public expenditure, Samuelson classified goods into two polar cases. One case, what he called collective consumption or public goods, were those in which there was no rivalry in consumption, so that if one person had available this good, everybody automatically had that same quantity available. And he added the notion that somehow it was very costly to exclude anybody from utilizing that good. Examples being television signals and lighthouses and so forth. Whereas at the other polar case, you have complete rivalry in use or consumption, so that if I have an apple, I can't eat the apple and you eat the apple simultaneously. There's a complete rivalry in one set and complete non-rivalry in the other set. And so he sort of separated those two with implications for organization. And Samuelson argued that obviously the market would work in the polar private good case, but it would not work at all over in the public goods case. And of course, we recognize that goods fall along that spectrum in between those two polar limits. But thinking about those polar limits made me think a bit about applying some of this logic to the recession. And in one sense, you can say what happened was that there was a failure to recognize that the rules, the structure, could not be private goods. Implicitly in the sort of modern Chicago type thinking is the notion that all goods are somehow partitionable, all goods are private, as opposed to the other scheme. And if you think about the rules, that the rules cannot be. So that's essentially what I talk about here in this particular paper. I think we need to sort of go back to basics and try to understand why it is that we can accept within limits this market efficiency notion. I've always had the view that there was something in the efficient market hypothesis, and I have no problem with it, but it was extended too far and without recognizing its limitations. It seems to me Muth, who had the original article on efficient markets, was fine. And to say that people, in fact, would recognize any possible rents there and would move to eliminate it. So if there would be no $20 bills, to use Mansur Olson's example, there would be no $20 bills on the street because somebody would have already picked it up. And the presumption is that somebody would be there to pick it up. So therefore, unexploited opportunities in the market, if it were an operative market, would likely to have been eliminated. So you can presume that they are eliminated. So that's the underlying logic of the efficient markets. I remember when Lucas and others first began talking further about the extending this notion of market efficiency, that my reaction was, it's fine if applied to one good, that is the Muth notion, but if you extend this to the whole economy, how can somebody pick up the equivalent of a $20 bill for the whole economy? And I remember I went down to Duke and gave a seminar when Ann Kruger was running the department down there. She invited me to come down and give a seminar. And my seminar was arguing that rational expectations so extended was not correct applied to the whole economy because there was no way that anybody could arbitrage and make a profit from, even if he could predict what the whole economy was likely to do. And I didn't do anything with that because I didn't have the technical tools to really get into the debate. But I remember the seminar, and I remember it went over pretty well. I didn't have any real objections to what I was saying. In writing this paper and others in this sequence, I realized that it's in a way extension of what I was doing of what I was saying at that time. Well, we might just go back and go over why it is that we can say that for the most part, so long as goods are partitionable or private in the Samuelson taxonomy, why it is that markets tend to be efficient, why we can take that as a working hypothesis that they are efficient. It depends critically on presumption that there is present some sharp-eyed entrepreneurs who are realizing that there are rents to be made, invest in trying to secure those rents, and by trying to secure those rents, they are dissipating the rents in the process, so the market tends to get resources to the most valued usage as determined by those who are making the evaluations. So the $20 bill does get picked up by somebody, and you can presume that it will get picked up. And that's perfectly fine so long as you're talking about markets in partitionable goods. But you can't extend that to talk about the institutions that emerge. And that is where the rational expectations, the whole expectational logic was overextended. There was a scientific error, I'm arguing, for people to have done that. I can't get my page turned here. Wait. Now, why can we say even in that context, why can we then say the market is efficient? It's because that's the way we define efficiency. We define efficiency to mean that it satisfies the preferences of individuals. The values are placed on goods by individuals in an exchange process. And so efficiency becomes that which is defined in the process of getting there. I did a little piece years ago in a criticism of a little book by Norm Barry in which I called order is defined in the process of its emergence, very much an Austrian type idea that I was putting in here. If we define efficiency to be satisfaction of individual preferences as revealed in markets, then if there are sharp-eyed entrepreneurs and if goods are petitionable, then of course we're going to get efficient outcomes. We're presuming all along that there are these potential possibilities. And it's important to recognize here, goes back to what I said about my Duke seminar, it's important to recognize that if the goods are petitionable, then all you need is one or two sharp entrepreneurs to go in and reap the profits, reap the rents, and in fact that will in fact ensure that the whole thing gets settled down. But if the goods aren't petitionable, you can see it's very difficult to organize corrections, as Samuelson pointed out. If you have a good that comes close over here in this polar case of publicness, that is, if there's no rivalry in end use of a good, and in fact if it's difficult to exclude people from enjoying the television signals or lighthouses. Of course, there are exceptions in both cases, and the market works to some extent. I'll get into that a little bit later. But the conceptual idea is proper, that if goods exhibit that characteristic, and to the extent they exhibit that characteristic, then you're not going to get it possible for sharp-eyed entrepreneurs to go in and secure a lot of rent because they would be benefiting everybody else as well as themselves. You can't uniquely impute that rent to the entrepreneur who happens to have the idea as opposed to a petitionable good. And so that's really the problem with trying to extend that. There's no way that you get sort of automatic adjustment to market difficulties or market failures. You get market failure when there are these spillover effects or externalities involved in dealings in goods that are non-partitionable. So then I come back to where I was before, that is to say, we need to sort of look more carefully at the goods that don't fit that partitionable. Now then you see, you stop pretty quickly at the limits of what the market will guarantee in terms of efficiency. What does it mean to say you have an efficient set of rules or set of structures? There's nothing that will allow entrepreneurs, no matter how bright they are in isolating rents, to capture the full gains of corrections. Suppose you have many people recognize that the rules under which your whole structure is operating are not good rules. Nobody can individually and privately get rich by changing the rules, because no one person can change the rules. It's a public goods type problem, and trying to determine what is or is not efficient in that context becomes a much more difficult problem than it is in the other case. I think we need a lot of work, and we have done practically no work at all on this whole area of what will the market do where you have goods that to some extent fit the Samuelson taxonomy of a public good, but you don't have collective action. It's not, you don't immediately therefore imply that collectivization of the good or the supply and demand of the good will work. Everybody will agree maybe that the rules you're operating under aren't proper or aren't efficient. They would at least be negative, but what would be efficient? And so the market will do something, and we need them. There's been very little work in that area of trying to predict what the market will generate in situations where you have a considerable amount of characteristics of a good that are public in the Samuelsonian sense. Ronald Coase wrote a piece on the lighthouse, which generated some discussion. Coase's idea was that the market will take care even of those type goods, and showing the historical example of the lighthouses. But Coase didn't recognize that that was not guaranteeing or proving that the result was efficient. He was simply showing that there were substitutes that could come about for goods that meet some of those criteria for publicness. And one of the closest things that comes to this is Nozick's discussion about anarchy, where Nozick talks about, in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Nozick talks about the possibility that you got, you start out he was answering Murray Rothbard, and trying to answer Murray Rothbard. And if you start out in complete anarchy, that protective associations will in fact emerge, and then one protective association will come to dominate, and that will become the monopoly, and that becomes the state. But Nozick does not argue that that's necessarily the efficient solution. He just argues that that would be the likely solution. And here that's his discussion about the emergence of the state. And those, Mansfield Olson gets into some of this in his stuff about the stationary bandits, how they emerged from the roving bandits and so forth. But there's been practically no work done in that sort of area, and we need to have a lot more work done. And we need more work on this whole notion of rules. Now, you can think of goods being either fitting these polar cases or all where in between. That is, they're purely private goods. That is, they're no rivalry, they're complete rivalry in end use. That is, if you have an apple, I can't eat the apple at the same time. On the other hand, there is complete publicness in the sense that if you have a television signal, I can have one at the same time without any more cost. Most goods are in between somewhere along this spectrum, and we sort of start thinking about the goods that fit these categories and where they belong, and how we that has some implications for organization. But the one thing we don't recognize, we fail to recognize, is that if we think of rules, I've already said this 2 or 3 times, but it's the critical point here. If we think of rules, they necessarily fit the Samuelson publicness category. The whole meaning of a rule is something, obviously we value rules versus order. We don't like disorder, and from Thomas Hobbes on, we know that people will pay something. They value order. They'll give up something in order to get order, in order to get security. So clearly they're goods in the sense that they're things we put value on. That is, these institutions of order are goods that we put value on. But those goods are strict Samuelsonian public goods. That is, they're strict goods that if they're available to one person, they're available to everybody, or else they wouldn't qualify as a rule. So we sit down to play poker, we agree on the rules, and the rules are going to apply to everybody. That is, everybody plays by the same game. And so we need to sort of apply the logic of the public goods to the structure. And we should never have, we made a big scientific error in trying to just go along and assume that structure that emerges is also efficient in the same sense that the outcome of ordinary goods that are rival goods will in fact emerge. And that was a fundamental error that I think we made. Nobody paid much attention to the fact that those two things are categorically different. And the Samuelson taxonomy is very helpful here in allowing us to think about the rules. But the implication of the Samuelson taxonomy is that if a good is in fact non-rivalrous, that is to say, if it applies to everybody and it's a rule, if a good is like that, then you're not going to get profit-seeking entrepreneurs investing in corrections that would be efficiency enhancing. Profit-seeking entrepreneurs are in that setting going to invest in institutions that will yield them differential rents to the extent they can get those differential rents. So the structure of rules that emerges from just a free play of market forces, you'll get some sort of rules. There will be some lighthouses built, but they will not necessarily at all be the efficient lighthouses. The lighthouses won't be located at the proper space, at the efficient place. But what is the efficient space? How do we know? How do we tell? And we need to do a lot more work in that kind of area that we really have not done. I'm now we're carrying on a bit further, going back and working more in how will the individual sort of face these alternatives in this situation. You can't depend on alert entrepreneurs to make the corrections. And therefore the market should never have been criticized for failure to provide its own structure. The market can't make its own rules. and conclude that those rules are necessarily efficient rules, because the market will generate some rules. They will come up, they will emerge. This is where I think some of Hayek's emphasis is wrongly placed. That is, Hayek and Leone and others have talked about the emergence of rules, of legal structures, analogous to the emergence of outcomes in markets. I think pointing out the analogy is useful, but on the other hand, to argue that the efficiency properties are comparable, I think is just wrong-headed. And I think we need to do more work on that whole area of how the institutions that happen to emerge really are a result of rent-seeking entrepreneurs, but there is no sort of order that emerges that will have an attribute of efficiency that it would have in the markets for ordinary goods. And that's more or less where I'm headed right now. That's where I stand right now. I think that's about all I want to say, and we can raise some questions about it. So we'll leave it there and let you raise whatever questions you want to. Yeah.
I'm sure there's going to be many questions. Let me just say, I'm going to run around and bring this microphone to you, not because it will magnify your voice, but because we're recording this. I'm going to start with David now.
I don't think it's on here.
No, it doesn't magnify my voice. It's just going to feed your opportunities. Yeah, so speak loudly. David Lee.
Oh, that was wonderful. I can't be let out by myself, obviously. This is wonderful. I wonder if you're working on a related puzzle that we've worked on, and that is, in economics, there is no professional code of ethics. And one of the ways that rules, standards come about in other groups is you have standard setters,
Yeah.
or codes of ethics. And it's really odd, this is one of the things that puzzles us, is in statistics, there are codes of ethics.
Yeah.
And so it's right alongside modern economics is statistics. And in statistics, there's very serious work on codes of ethics, and we just don't do that. We think that we can get along without ethics. And so maybe it's the blindness you are seeing toward how rules come about is replicated in some of the stuff that it just isn't there. There isn't a code of ethics. There's no attention to code of ethics in economics. And so that there's just a hole in our vision. We just don't see the importance of rules. Somehow we think that they take care of themselves.
Well, that's certainly true that we think the idea is that they take care of themselves and there's been no attention to it. On the other hand, and I don't object to your discussion of the code of ethics. To me, that raises a whole host of interesting questions. But I don't think you can point specifically to a violation of some implicit code of ethics in this particular context. One thing I didn't mention, I forgot now, but I will mention while I have a chance. We need and this is an excellent dissertation topic for somebody.
Yes.
We need to go and compare the pre-Chicago, what old Chicago school, Henry Simon's, Frank Knight School of Chicago, which argued that the market works but only within a structure of rules, and they didn't really get into examining very much the structure. And there was a very closely parallel argument going on at that same time in the Freiburg School in Germany under Walter Eucken and Müller-Armach and Röpke to some extent. And somebody with a knowledge of German needs to take the Freiburg School and the old Chicago School, and look at what was happening in those ideas in the 40s, basically in the 40s, because they were both concerned about, they were both objecting either explicitly or implicitly of the idea that the markets work everywhere. They were saying markets work, but only within a structure. And so there's a useful sort of comparison of these two bodies of discussion at that time.
We have a few Oiken sorts here.
Thank you. I understand the distinction between the private goods and public goods, and I understand the clarity of achieving efficiency in the private goods area and the lack of certainty or clarity in public goods area. And but does the notion of efficiency in the public goods area achieve some coherence if we think about things that move us closer to efficiency, rules that move us closer to efficiency or further away from efficiency? In particular, the work that I've done for 30 years, and mostly in the energy area, dealing with natural monopoly assets, it really wasn't all that hard, even though we didn't have a perfect model of competition for those assets, to figure out that one set of rules was dumb and took us away from efficiency, and another set of rules was smarter and moved us toward efficiency. Is that a helpful concept or not in terms of how you deal with the public goods problem?
I think that's very helpful. And matter of fact, I think you're right in the sense that a lot of these things are sort of common sense observations will help here. And in the case of coastal and lighthouses, it's clearly true that the market would provide some lighthouse services out there, even though it might not meet the efficiency frontier in a meaningful sense, Pareto sense, but it would be maybe moving toward a more efficient solution. As opposed to that, you have situations, in our instance in this paper, Jacob Viner a long time ago was upset about the customs unions. And he was arguing that a customs union amongst a small number of a whole trading network would maybe do more harm than good. Actually, it's a version of second best. The whole second best argument is the idea here, similar to what we're talking about. You may move away from the efficiency frontier rather than toward it in certain contexts. But you can, as you're right, you can in fact recognize a lot of these. Some of them are obvious, some of them not, type of thing.
I'm Dan Hammond, and my question is about old Chicago and new Chicago. I recall seeing Milton Friedman give a talk shortly after the Soviet Union came apart, and he was asked for his advice, and he said 3 words: privatize, privatize, privatize. And it turns out that was overly simple,
Yeah.
and he recognized that later on. So my question about the new Chicago, as you call Lucas, perhaps Stigler, but you mainly refer to Lucas, are they really arguing that the market will produce efficient rules, or are they simply ignoring the problem of rules? I think how you react to them depends on the answer to that question. Your paper seems to suggest that they are really Hayekians, that they see the market producing rules, rather than not paying attention to the problem of rules in institutions.
I think in the way you posed it, I think they were more guilty of ignoring it rather than explicitly recognizing it. They might have been quite willing to recognize it, the limits of it here, but they were basically ignoring it in part, and this tells in a point that I think worth making in this context. That is, in part it was due to the fact that at this same time all this was happening, that they're moving toward these efficient market models. They were in fact enamored of this new type of procedures, terminologies, models, mathematics, all these things. I think that sort of helped it along, so to speak. But I don't think they were just concerned with it. I don't think, at least certainly not explicitly, they were not Hayekians in the sense. But you can read them as being that, but
Concerning rules and efficiency, is there possibly an argument that there's a Hayekian type argument, that there's sort of a meta competition going on among systems and rules, and here a social system will have tried certain rules, some will work, some will not. People will see what's there and they'll move towards those that are efficient, however it's defined. So there's no sense of defining efficiency. It is simply that systems will look and see what works and what doesn't. So there's some overall sense. Now the issue is, how long does that take? And what role do individuals, say economists, have in sort of guiding that? But it seems to me there is this other rule, so other type of argument for efficiency. It's not about market efficiency. It is simply about efficiency. People like better outcomes as opposed to worse, and sort of the association of efficiency with markets seems to me to sort of lose this dimension of competition. I see efficiency associated with competition, and when I think and define efficiency, I think of achieving some goal. I don't know what that goal is, and because I don't, I leave it to society, and in that sense, I'm Hayekian, but it's not the Hayekian that I think Dan sort of suggested. That, it's a different type, and that differentiates those two.
well, I think it's right. There is a certain sense in which you get this kind of competition at this level of institutions and structures, but you also mentioned, and it's quite proper, that this is not only a long-term process, but what do you mean by betterness here? And this is what stumped Hayek. Hayek never answered that question. He was searching around, and he got in. Some of this stuff is extreme that he finally went into about the number of people it would support, a system would support, and so forth and so on. What do you mean by survival sort of context there? Tell you a little bit of a story. Hayek was writing, he had this huge project. I can start the whole story. Hayek had this idea of writing, getting a dialogue going between the socialist and the market economists. And he was going to get some funding, and he was going to organize a worldwide set of television debates between socialists on the one hand and market-type economists on the other hand. And he was going to have something like 12 of these debates, worldwide television, everything, great, grandiose ideas. And so he called me up, amongst others, wanted to know what my reaction to this scheme was. And I said, well, you'll never get 12 socialists to argue with the market types. And but he went on with this anyway, and he made a proposal to get some of this and get funding for it I was not there, but at the Montpellier meeting in Japan at the time. And other people had exactly the same reaction that I did. This is entirely too grandiose. But they finally said, well, why don't you just write a book on this great conflict and get some funding for yourself. Don't worry about these conferences. And so he got some funding, and so the idea was that he was going to write this huge 3-volume thing on socialism versus the market. And he then wrote 1 volume. At least he allegedly wrote 1 volume, which became The Fatal Conceit. But he sort of said he was part way through a manuscript. So then Steve Pavich organized a conference in Hayek's summer place in Obergürtel in Austria. And so about 12 or 13 of us or more were invited to go and read this manuscript and help Hayek how he would in fact revise this volume. So it was an interesting conference. We went to Obergürtel, and Hayek handed out this volume, and most of it were just empty chapters. He only had a few chapters written, and then most of it just outlined. Really in terrible, terrible shape. And when we actually came up with a view that he shouldn't publish it, it was not worth publishing, because it would deter from his other work. It was much lower level work. And he didn't solve this problem about what are your survival criteria. And he came up with this view that, in fact, there was a number of people that your system would support, which was, none of us liked that idea. But he said, well, I've already signed the contract, so I've got to finish the book. So what do we tell him to do? What do we tell him to do? Well, you bet yourself a good person and help you. Well, then Bill Bartley came on board. And the book, as it came out, was not a bad book in a certain sense. And it's more Bartley than it is Hayek, because Bartley really fixed that book up, took a terrible manuscript and made it meaningful a little bit. It's still not nearly up to Hayek's other work, but that's the story about the fatal conceit. But Hayek never could resolve that problem. He wanted to say what you said. He wanted to say that somehow or other competition among institutions themselves are always leading us toward a better and better situation. But how do you define better? Or does it just throw up something and you don't have any? And so that's more or less my position. I don't think you can. I don't think it's possible. Unless you can get, ultimately, I come back to the Vixelian notion, ultimately somehow you could get agreement. You could say, in effect, it's better, but aside from that, you can't do, you're up against it.
Ali Khan, thank you for this emphasis on public versus private. And I want to go back to this distinction between ideology and scientific error. And let us leave ideology and ethics aside and move on to scientific error. And in terms of the scientific error, I feel somewhat intimidated telling you this, but I have a supplementation to this dichotomy between the public and the private. And that supplementation revolves around decreasing costs or increasing returns to scale. So in a sense, when the efficiency argument is made, there is a presumption that eventually increasing returns to scale will be exhausted. But if that is not so, then it connects to this question of emergence of rules. We have no rules on how the price system would behave if the increasing returns to scale are not exhausted. So the supplementation that I have in mind is to supplement Lindahl with hoteling. So some sort of, so this is not to take away the emphasis on public and private. I think it is crucial. But when you underscore it with this possibility of increasing returns to scale, with the possibility of bringing, I am telling the author of the essays on decreasing costs, when you are bringing the decreasing cost consideration into account, then we are really at sea, so it seems to me. So I wanted some reaction on that.
No, it sounds fascinating to me. That's possibilities. I don't marry the two things in my own mind, and it's that's worth thinking about further. I'd like to think more about it. I don't have any immediate reaction, but
yeah, I'd like to, what comes to my mind when you start talking about rules and where they come from and evaluating the rules does arise, it seems that there's going to be an infinite regress problem. Once you start evaluating the rules, then who evaluates the rule makers and so on and so on. It's basically to be used as sort of the Gödel incompleteness problem. And so what do you say about that issue, that there is this sort of fundamental infinite regress issue and incompleteness about the whole process?
well, that's certainly true until you get back the way I at least think about it and resolve it in my own mind is, in an ultimate sense, it has to be agreement or consensus is the only, that's sort of the stopping point. Otherwise, you keep going further and further back, you know. That's not a good satisfactory answer, I realize that. But.
Relatively absolute.
Yeah, right.
All too often, the people who rules. There was an interesting example in the New York Times. The financial industry pushed to get the patent office to change the rule, and their push was upheld by the Supreme Court, to allow them to patent business methods. Just recently, the banks have been paying off big fees to somebody who had a patent on clearing checks, that is to read, print out of checks and to clear the checks automatically. The financial industry got Senator Schumer to publish a new rule, a new law about patents. And it will only apply to the financial industry. That is something tailor-made for a business that gets a rule made one way, then it becomes inconvenient. And then they go back to the authorities, get the rule made in another way to block out somebody who's trying to make a profit right here lawfully.
That's a very good comment, very good. That's exactly what I'm trying to say, in a sense. You're supporting it in a sense that well, you'll get rules, but the rules will be made by people seeking rents for themselves, and they won't have any idea. And those rents aren't to be dissipated by others coming in. You can't have a competition like that. So that's a very good set of examples. And I realized that something like that was going on in the financial sector. I'm just not knowledgeable enough about it myself to give you specifics, but yours is quite a good specific example of what goes on, or that's going on here.
Before Till is going to make a comment, I just want to remark that last night at dinner, Deirdre made a remark that the world defined in terms of left and right is very much simplified. And I would just like to know, the room to know, that Michael Perelman and Jim Buchanan just agreed. That is extraordinary.
Okay, one question about the strategy of distinguishing between scientific error and ideology. I didn't really got the point, because what you were saying is, okay, we can go on with the same ideology, we just change the rules so that some sort of behavior is no longer possible. But isn't it the same as saying, well, let's blame the ideologists and prohibit some sort of behavior as long as we agree on the new rule?
I don't quite get the question you're raising. My point was that if we sort of start from saying this is my ideological position, that's going to dominate my discussion, you are closing off discussion much more rapidly than we could if we said, well, let's talk about the science, let's talk about the underlying, ignoring all these problems about defining what science is and so forth. But at least it seems to me we have a basis for further discussion there that is not present when we say, well, let's just talk about the ideology. If I start from what Koletsky argues that these economists started from, that is a sort of market fundamentalist mindset, by which he means that the market's going to prevail regardless, and he would accuse them of having rather explicitly extended this notion of efficiency as a result of their ideology. I think the other comment was much better. They just ignored this because for several reasons. It was more an ignorance, and if you could bring them on board would be a way of talking about them that you really made a fundamental error in your analysis here, in your identification of what you're talking about, really. It's that level. And you might get somewhere in terms of discussion with them, whereas if you sort of say, well, I reject your ideology, you don't get very far.
Josh Binney, my question was related to, you discussed in depth really the difference between public and private goods, and you mentioned Coase's paper on the lighthouse, and my reading of the paper when he discussed the British lighthouse system was really that he ignored a main part of that system, which was still a great deal of government involvement, really, in the fact that the government was enforcing the right of lighthouse owners to collect tolls. And I guess I'm at a loss to really understand the difference, at least maybe from COSA's perspective, between the government enforcing the right of somebody to collect a toll and the government collecting the toll itself. You know, we talk about a Samuelson-type solution to these problems, which would normally, from his perspective, be for the government to just come in and provide the public good themselves. And I wondered if you could really comment on if there is a difference between what Coase was saying was happening in England and what Samuelson might have suggested really in a functional way.
Well, one or two of the articles that were stimulated by Coase's articles, I'm sure you're familiar with, made the point that you made, the early point. That is to say, Coase, this wasn't a market really area, much more government involved than Coase implied when he argued that this was a defense of the market providing a public good. And I think that's a relevant criticism, because certainly if the government enforces the right to you to collect tolls, you are, in a sense, operating as a public good, even though it may be called nominally a private ownership or something like that. So that's an excellent point. I think that Coase's interest there was much more general to sort of argue, and he didn't argue this way, but he could have argued a little bit more that, in fact, markets do generate some outcomes. The lighthouse might not have been a good example, but...
My question gets back to David Colander's point about there's some sort of meta process for efficiency creation in the rules. And in a sense, David, wouldn't that be anti-Gresham's law, in that the good rules force out the bad rules? And that's sort of what I heard you arguing. And it would seem to me that that could occur, certainly, and it could also, the opposite could occur. So I wonder, you know, there seems to be a big avenue of research here to figure out what are the conditions in which you would have some sort of Gresham's law. The bad rules are going to drive out the good rules. That's typically what we worry about, rather than the reverse.
Is that directed at Dave or?
Well, to both.
Well, I think that's a very good point. I think that is, I would be on the side, your side. There's much more as leaning toward David, I would lean toward your position. Could be good, could be bad. It goes back to what I said about the customs union issue versus the other types of things. You know, some of those things are pushing you toward the frontier, some of them are not. You don't have the same criteria, in other words, that you do in other cases.
I think I disagree to some degree. In other words, Gresham's law is about money. It has to do with a particular element of money and what happens. It makes sense within there. Although you've also pointed out good money can push out bad money. So, you know, go both ways. Because people want to use good money. One time people accept it, one time people give it. The issue with rules, I think there is some overall general tendency towards sort of here, the socialist system you took a look at. A lot of people believed in socialism and sort of moved away from that because they didn't think it met. Now that doesn't mean other types of socialist systems might not work or that capitalism is the best or anything else. It's just it didn't work and they moved towards that because of that. I think if you look at the progression of overall history, we get things that work. That doesn't mean we can't make enormous problems. We don't have lots of rules going the other way. All of the issues that I agree with Michael Perlman too, that there's a set of rules, and so then people say, what we really need is a rule about rules. And of course, if you look at classical liberalism, that was really what it was about. We've got to stop people using government to achieve the ends they want by placing limitations on it. And so, you know, so if you keep looking and keep moving up to that higher and higher level, you'll never make it. But the presumption is asymptotically, you're getting a little bit closer maybe to it. And so that's the hope. So my statement would be, yes, I think there's a movement towards something getting better. It is not definite that it has to happen at any time. It's a very, very long period of thousands of years, in which case you can't make any implications about particular laws or anything else. That has to be based on something else. But that overall presumption, which is a type of presumption of evolution, is something I argue for. I don't think it can be justified scientifically, oh, this is proof. But that's sort of my read of sort of looking at things.
Okay, my name is McCluskey, Deirdre McCluskey. I want to challenge you, Jim, on your axiom, on your premise that we can't argue or can't argue about or persuade each other about matters of ethics and ideology. I don't think that's true. And it's crucial to your case that it be true. You have for a long time had this somewhat, if you'll excuse me, somewhat tragic vision of the problem of making rules, making constitutions. As you point out this morning, constitutions are extremely public goods, and therefore there are free riders, as Paul said. But if we have, as you just said, David, if there are ethical commitments, say, to always vote or to do your part in building the Department of Economics, a hard case, or ideological commitments, those can ground rulemaking. In fact, they're the only thing that can ground it. If you exclude the ethics, as I'm going to say this afternoon, there's no way that there are going to be anything like optimal rules. It's going to be the war of all against all, and the life of humans is going to be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. How do you react?
Well, I don't really have that much objection to what you're saying.
Really?
It seems to me that I was trying to make this distinction in response, as I said, to this Koletsky notion. He's taking a view that if this is market ideology that you're talking about, market fundamentalism,
yeah,
that therefore you just dismiss sort of economists and markets and market efficiency. He wanted to throw the whole thing out and talk about a structure really more of a corporatism, fascism type structure in which the big guys, and I just say this in passing here, I'm greatly concerned about this concentration of power in these big banks. I'd like to see them smattered. I'm on Ron Paul's side. I think the whole Fed ought to be eliminated.
I agree.
That gets me into a lot of other discussion. But the point is, I think you're right in the sense that, to be sure, and a lot of this is implicit and we don't recognize it in many cases, a lot of just ordinary dealings there's an underlying ethical cement there. It's got to be there.
Yeah,
otherwise things would fall apart. You're quite right. I've had this argument explicitly with Gordon Tullock for years and also with George Stigler.
Yeah.
Because they somehow think if you get it all incentives right, or Becker, if you get the incentives all right, everything will work. Of course it won't work. It requires a certain set of underlying ethics that I'm quite happy to discuss. But at the level at which I was doing this, which is criticizing Kaliski more than anything else, I do think it's useful to make this distinction.
But on the other hand, you are making this morning an ideological argument against this contrary ideology, which you correctly note is similar to corporatism and fascism in the 1920s and 30s. So you know, Jim, either fish or cut bait.
Yeah.
Either, you know, you gotta, you're the one to do the, and you have. I mean, I'm saying you're self-contradicting. You have done the ideological work, and Hayek did too, and Milton Friedman did, and so did people on the other side. So we do argue about ideology as though we thought our words had some point. If we really didn't, if this theory that a lot of moderns have, that ethics is just about opinion, were true, then there'd be absolutely no point in talking about it at all. And that's your self-contradictory premise. That is, you don't act that way, either personally or intellectually. So I accuse you of self-contradiction. J'accuse. Let's move on.
It's like a form of law with old defense.
Yeah. Well, David already gave my answer earlier. I've always said that Frank Knight's phrase helps me a great deal in many cases in terms of talking about the relatively absolute. So in a sense, I agree with you fundamentally, but it's a question of how much you bring to the top, how much you don't.
I'm glad Deidre warmed up on the ethics topic. I wanted to push those lines a little bit too. You mentioned the $20 bill working in private, non-public goods context. If you look at ethics over the long run, ethics in Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian tradition has been the dominant ethos, still is in this country. When you mention underlying glue of the people, of the rules that people tacitly act upon. Academia, if you open up an ethics book in MBA in business, it's got utilitarians, Aristotelians, Kantians. And academics have always bumped up against the Judeo-Christian tradition, specifically like the Smithian school comes to mind here at U of R. Smith had to bump up against that dominant ethos. Do you, in your thinking, pay attention to the empirics of the dominant ethos when designing a dominant macroeconomy?
Well, I don't design a macroeconomy. I don't think anybody designs it. I think I think the people in that economy, somehow it has to emerge. They have to design it. So I don't. I think I'm not sure how to go respond there further.
And I should have restricted it to designing the rules. There are obviously going to be elites that help to determine the rules in an optimal way. So not design all actions, but design the rules.
Well, certainly I think the rules would be different given the underlying culture, which would involve the ethos, as you say, of the situation. And you'd want different rules than you would in places where you have a dominant Judeo-Christian ethic, which is in the sort of like we traditionally have had in this country.
I'm Anna de Braakeren. Thank you for your talk. I appreciated it. I wanted to elaborate a little bit on the example Mr. Perelman gave. I was wondering, you were talking, two things that came to mind with me was order and efficiency, two of the central things in your talk. Well, I was wondering, you were talking about the private goods and how rent seekers make sure by seeking the rent that the rent disappears. Then with public goods, as rules, if they seek rent, they will invest in rules that will keep the rent. But then Mr. Peruman gave an example that shows that when we all seek to define the rules in our own advantage, we can keep on taking the rent away. We can keep on making the rent or keeping the rent, but then there will be somebody else who takes the rent away. So I see that there's a difference between playing by the rules and playing with the rules, which is kind of what was evident in your example. And I see a lot of ethical problems, but how would you respond to this? Because in a way, it does take care of the efficiency problem. So isn't that a little bit contradictory?
I don't see that there's much contradiction here. It seems to me that in the case the rules that apply have to be this Samuelson technology applied, taxonomy applies, everybody has to be subject to the rules. Therefore, it's not going to be to anybody's advantage to somehow generate rules that will dissipate bad rules. So you'll get rules put into the advantage of the persons who are proposing them. They're seeking the rents. Now you get that also in in petitionable goods. But the point is, if the old classic, as I mentioned, the old classic Chicago-Winnipeg example, if it gets too far, if the wheat price gets too far out of line compared to transport costs, somebody can make a fortune. One person can make a fortune. So you get, and that corrects the price differential pretty quickly. Whereas you don't have something like that in the rules. Nobody can independently change the rules. That has to come out with a constitutional convention or idealized or stylized or something. And so you get people, if you don't have any set of rules that are there, you get people somehow like we mentioned in the example over here, you get these financial gurus, they're setting up these things and the rules to benefit them, and there's no pressure in the same. So there's pressure. There's no doubt there's some evolutionary type pressure, and maybe the Great Recession is an example that you are forced by the catastrophe to come up with something. But that's a pretty high price to pay for getting this. We can do better, in other words.
My name is Stefan Kolle from the Wilhelm Röpke Institute in Germany. I have a question on Hayek. We've been talking about Hayek as the cultural evolutionist, but I think we should distinguish this very late Hayek from the Hayek of the 1930s and in the 1940s. Because you've been talking about Walter Eucken. If you read the correspondence of Hayek to Eucken or the correspondence of Hayek to Simons, you see that this 1930s and 1940s Hayek is quite in accord with old Chicago and with Freiburg. So would you see this distinction between the Hayek, let's say, of the Road to Serfdom and of the Constitution of Liberty on the one hand side, and Hayek of the Fatal Conceit on the other side?
Oh yeah, I think there was a dramatic shift. He shifted somehow, you're dating it about right, I think. Somehow long after he wrote the third volume of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, somehow that evolutionary thing dominated from then on. And the first part is much better Hayek, in my view, than the latter stuff.
Since it was the organizer's fault that we started a little late, we're going to go for another 5 minutes or so, just so that we have the full hour and a half, and then I'll take a shorter break. Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Martin from GMU. Professor Buchanan, I had a further question about the tension between your views and, I guess, the later Hayek, as Stefan was pointing out. I think Jacob Weiner's criticism of this later Hayek was that government itself couldn't be seen as separate from an evolutionary process, that it too was enmeshed in historical contingency and path dependency. And so the question is, for the implicit alternative that you put forward of a constitutional moment, a constitutional mentality, do you view that arises outside of this process? Are you in effect holding up for us an ethical ideal that we view each other as equals? How do you extricate your own alternative from social evolution?
Oh, that's a good point. I don't think you can fully do that. I think you can, we're all part of the process. On the other hand, you can try to limit what you're talking about, and you can't cover everything, it seems to me. I just don't, you can act as if somehow you detach yourself and be the Adam Smith's impartial spectator. It's an imaginary construction, but you can work at that level, even though you recognize that you can't be. And Hayek himself emphasized that, a good point, that is, you can never sort of step out of the world. You may want to, but you never can do it. And so you're a participant always here. And you can maybe make some, by trying to be, you may be able to make some progress. But sometimes you can make terrible mistakes too. A lot of the stuff on social choice, for example, simply does try to make that mistake. They don't know what you're, and you get to the point where you don't know what you're talking about.
Thank you.
Give his word for those kind of arguments.
She said in front of my son last night.
I would repeat it in front of you.
To think that your son might never have heard that word before. I just wanted to defend Jim a little bit about Deidre's charges. And it has to do with what I'd call ideology, the concept of ideology, and the concept of normative goals. I think, sort of my understanding of what you're saying is once it's become ideological, you can't debate it. And that's almost, in my sense, the way ideology means is goals that I have that I will not debate. So that, in my sense, is my understanding of ideology. You can debate normative goals, and sort of that should be very much part of the debate and isn't, so within economics. Within that, we agree. But what I'm saying is I don't call having normative goals having an ideology. Having normative goals is something that anybody has to have. Having an ideology means I believe so strongly in those goals that I am not opening it up. Now, maybe that's a different definition, but that's, I think, the way you're using it. It's the way I use it, and I'm not sure about other people, so I just wanted to say that distinction.
You mean then bad ideology, or rigid ideology, or stupid ideology?
That's, all those go without saying. They're unnecessary
But they don't.
that ideology.
No, it's a common misuse, likewise, of the word rhetoric. We've got a lot of words in English. One was just articulated for bad argument. Okay? So let's keep the word rhetoric for the art, as Aristotle said, the study of the available means of persuasion. Let's keep the word ideology for beliefs arguable about public matters of ethics. And look, there are a whole bunch of examples in this room of people who've changed their ideologies. I'm one. I was once a Joan Baez socialist.
Let me make a comment that relates to this. First of all, I preface my remarks by saying that if I were religious, I would like to be a Mormon. So I have a great admiration for the Mormons. That's prefacing my remark. But I spent some time at Brigham Young, and that's the reason I came to admire the Mormons in many ways. And there's some very good friends of mine, good people, especially in philosophy out there at that time. They were. And we could carry on a discussion about fundamental philosophical questions. Very good, knowledgeable questions. But there are certain things, certain types of questions that they simply cut off discussion. Just back to this point David made, it just won't discuss certain issues. You run square up against that ideological wall. That's what I think I would say mean by ideology. I think once you get to that level where you just simply, and I learned from Frank Knight, as everybody did who listened to Frank Knight, nothing should be off the board. I tell you, everything should be discussable, everything. Whereas if you're religious in a certain, that's what I mean really by ideology here, you're saying, well, this I close off a discussion. I therefore won't discuss it, you see.
Yeah, but, that's if you pardon, a kind of an anti-clerical view, which I understand very well. Because I have lots of friends that way, and I've been that way, and so on and so forth. And religion is discussable, at least among us Episcopalians. Maybe there are forms of religion which take this anti-intellectual form, anyway, in some parts of their belief. But I don't think that goes along with being religious. I don't think it goes along with being ideological. I don't think it goes along with being self-conscious about rhetorical matters. All three of those don't have to be non-discussable. In which case, we better discuss them.
Yeah.
I think you and Frank might agree.
Do you want to come back?
No.
I think that's a good note on which to conclude. So thank Jim Buchanan for our going to take a break. We'll come back here at 10:30. How many of you are students in the room? Graduate students?